Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Authenticity and Anxiety in the Art of Kafka and Kirchner. K has become the most important letter in the alphabet of anxiety, stamped on the modern sensibility. K is the scarlet letter that now might stand for ambiguity, the hieroglyph that resists deciphering, the symbol that represents nothing that can be conclusively decoded. K is the key into an illegible world, whose absurdity is the only matrix of meaning and whose laws are the arbitrary projections of an absentee God. Stephen Whitfield, Comic Echoes to Kafka. The Panther, Rainer Maria Rilke. From seeing the bars, his seeing is so exhausted that it no longer holds anything anymore. To him, the world is bars, 100,000 bars, and behind the bars, nothing. The lithe swinging of that rhythmical, easy stride, which circles down to the tiniest hub, is like a dance of energy around a point in which a great will stands stunned and numb. Only at times the curtains of the pupil rise without a sound. Then a shape enters, slips through the tightened silence of the shoulders, reaches the heart, and dies. Well, hi everybody. And today, as you can see from the title, I want to combine, as is usual on this channel, the artwork of Ernst Kirchner and a piece of work that I've been looking at in various guises, including a live stream discussion, but Kafka's The Metamorphosis. And what I'm going to do is develop the idea of authenticity. And I was put on with reference to The Metamorphosis and Kirchner's work. And I was put on by someone whose name will not be mentioned. This is Dr. Todd Rose, and he was on the Mel Robbins Podcast. And he talks, his key concept is the idea of authenticity. And you can just about make out in the background, he's got a book there called Collective Illusions. So he has various notions, that's one of them, whereby the causes of an inauthentic life, and obviously in a highly mediated modern technological world, there are many more barriers to direct authenticity because, as the word media implies, mediation, media gets in the way of it, mediates. And I don't quite follow or subscribe to all of his ideas. So, for example, not so much his ideas as his mode of thinking about notions of authenticity. So he has ideas like 3 key principles, and he started in Harvard a laboratory, the laboratory for the Science of Individuality, I think it was called. And it's quite a systematic approach. So whilst I am totally in favour of his arguments about the importance of authenticity, and I'm glad it's getting the coverage that it is, I'd argue this channel's all about doing it simultaneously, more directly and less directly, if that doesn't sound paradoxical, because good art deals with the authentic by its very nature, but it doesn't do what academics like Todd Rose do. It doesn't systematize and do things in a rigorously schematic way. Rather, it's implicit in the nature of the art itself. But I think it's going to be a growing theme in future because of the influence of influences, the influence of a heavily mediated environment. Authenticities and authentic aspects to life are more and more difficult to obtain. And I remember, I think it was definitely in Philadelphia. I think it's called South Street. It was a trendy. This is the late 80s, so I don't know how the city's evolved since then. So it was 87, 88, I think it was, and I remember distinctly seeing a sign across the road, and it said South Street, if that is the name of it. Apologies if I've misremembered. But it said South Street, the coolest street in Philly. And that goes to this notion of authenticity. Even at that relatively young age, it struck me that if you have to put a sign across the street proclaiming how cool it is, maybe it's a self-defeating exercise. You can't be that cool if you have to advertise the fact. So authenticity can be a strange phenomenon. And there are lots of, do you recognize it when you see it, or how do you define it? And I'd suggest there are various connotations. So one thing is you can't just claim it. Authenticity is something earned, not claimed. But it has aspects of immediacy, rawness. It's natural, so in some senses it's non-performative. And then you've got an immediate irony with art. Art by its nature is artificial and to some extent often directly performative. And yet art can also, at its best, encapsulate the raw and the immediate, because the mediation of art allows you to express very authentic feelings in the guise of a sublime art form. Whereas with modern media, it's almost the exact opposite. You seem or appear to be authentic, yet that authenticity is actually the product of a lot of artificial manipulations and mediations through the technology you're using. And it's the concept of distance and authenticity. So the media plays this double game whereby you're seeing people directly, you're hearing them. So there's a sense of immediacy, but also you're distant at the same time. It's a false sense of immediacy. Whereas with a piece of literature, for example, you can be distant from the writer by centuries, thousands of years even, yet somehow there's an immediacy of the written word. So the concept of authenticity and how it plays out in practice, I think, is really complicated. But what Todd Rose is looking at is, to some extent, crowd mentality and the way in which people become conformist. So I think one of his books was called Beyond Average. And he's trying to reapply the notion of individuality in very direct ways. And I'd go back to, I'm developing a live stream and a playlist all to do with, it's nominally called, the working title, An Agnostic Guide to the Bible. And in the book of Genesis, there are various scholars I've been reading, biblical scholars, who their argument is, from the book of Genesis onwards, the Old Testament can be interpreted as a humanist tract. And one of the key elements in the book of Genesis, which for many people can be a bit dull and boring and they don't quite know what's going on, but it can be read as when, for example, it says in the Bible that man is given dominion over the animal world. There's a particularity to human beings that isn't shared by animals, no matter how much we may love our pets, for example. And one guy I'll be looking at specifically, Mark Glauberman, really develops this as a philosophical concept, the particularity of human beings, and how the Bible, its innate philosophy, and it does have a philosophy according to Mark Glauberman, is this the particularity of people, their individuality. So immediately I'd argue that Todd Rose's notions of individuality, at Harvard, he created this laboratory for the Science of Individuality. It's contained 3,000 years ago, almost, probably 2,700 years ago, I guess, the Old Testament type writings. The concept of individuality is baked into writing as old as the origins of Western civilization. And today I want to show how that also can be seen in the different art forms, the literature of Kafka and the artwork of Kirchner. And I've chosen to match them up because obviously if I'm going to talk about individuality and authenticity, I can't just lump them both together clumsily. But they did have very deep insights into their own self-reflection of their own personalities. They were quite neurotic and troubled people. And that, I'd argue, comes out in their work quite visibly in Kirchner's case. And you can't read Kafka and not be aware that he was a troubled soul, but he turned that troubled soul into a vehicle to produce some absolutely sublime writing. So this concept of authenticity, it's got different connotations. So I don't think authenticity is a concept or a phrase that you can just define simplistically or schematically. It's got various connotations, one of which might be immediacy, which I've alluded to, but non-mediated immediacy. And as I've said, that immediately throws up the problem in a highly mediated, technologized society. How do you achieve proper authenticity? The self-expression, to what extent can you express yourself authentically? If you're, and I think this is what Todd Rose talks about, if you're living in a world where your ideas are overly manipulated, or not even directly manipulated, but if you're influenced by, guess what? There's no accident they're called that. Influences. There's authenticity has connotations of veracity and truth. And there's the Latin phrase in vino veritas, which means in wine there is truth, meaning when people get drunk, often their inner self, the things, their inhibitions drop off. But to some extent, the real person comes out, because the various social filters that they have are no longer there. And I find that interesting because it's not obviously drinking alcohol, but I think great artists are also able, in a more structured way, to remove those filters, or to find through their art forms ways of accessing the concept of authenticness and what it is to express yourself authentically beyond the influence of the herd, the conformist masses. But notwithstanding, they can be authentic but also be influenced by previous writings. So Harold Bloom, the great American critic, talks about the anxiety of influence. So as an artist, you are influenced by the past, you are influenced by past artists, but it's getting that balance of being influenced and then moving beyond them. So a good artist will not conform blindly with what's gone before. They will be influenced by it, but also create something new and worthwhile. So I mentioned the in vino veritas because it just interests me. It's one of the last areas of modern life when people do get drunk that they, like I said, their inhibitions go and they can be their real selves. And I think one of Todd Rose's strongest arguments is the way in which there's an institutionalization of not saying out loud, self-centering, not saying out loud what you really think. And that's become enshrined in various forms of technology and fears of being doxxed and all these newly technologically mediated phenomena that are going on that haven't been around before. And one of his key ideas, I'll just finish on this before I move on to the actual artists we want to look at, but he has this concept of beyond average, this constant moving beyond the conformist. And this is directly relevant to Kafka's work and Kirchner because they were producing their work in, well, the Metamorphosis was published in 1916. Kirchner was producing up until he died in 1938. So they both were producing before the horrors of the Second World War. And I think both of them identified the fragmentation of individual authenticity as the world became geared up to more totalitarian ways of thinking. And I don't think today people use the word fascist glibly and they overuse it. I don't think just because you disagree with someone politically you should use that term. But I do think they're more totalitarian, both on left and right, There are more totalitarian tendencies, ideological purity, and authenticity being drowned out by the need to join in really powerful ideologies that take away your need to think for yourself. And again, to repeat, I think that's true on the left and the right. And the totalitarian tendency of that, we've seen it with things like Mao's China. But you've got all of that, the cultural revolution that took place in China decades ago, the type of brainwashing that was engaged in. You've now got that in liberal democracies with technology to facilitate that process. And I think it creates some quite alarming tendencies. And to introduce Kirchner and Kafka, just to repeat, they were at the beginning of documenting that process through their art. When I say beginning, we can argue over when some of these totalitarian tendencies truly began. You can go back to the Enlightenment and Rousseau and people like that. But insofar as at least just before the totalitarians really took over in the 20th century, Kafka and Kirchner were portraying some of the social atmosphere immediately prior to these events. So I mentioned 1916. This is the Metamorphosis in German. Die Verwandlung. And it's interesting, the first edition cover there, Kafka insisted that the creature, the insect he's turned into, the monstrous vermin, it says in the opening line, wasn't portrayed. He wanted it to be indeterminate. So you've got this Edvard Munch-like man clutching his head rather than the depiction of the bug itself. And the book, I might repeat some of the things that were said in the live stream, so apologies in advance, but I just thought reintroducing some of those ideas in a different context with the text in front of us might be vaguely useful. But there's so much contemporary relevance to this story. There's the hikikomori I've spoken about in other videos, the notion of the Japanese shut-ins, people who never leave the house, social outcasts. It's a bit like me, really, but quickly moving on. The notion of self-loathing, the anxiety mentioned in the title, especially in Kafka's case, he was anxious. He wanted to be an authentic writer, but he was in a social milieu. His father wasn't a well-educated man. He had to earn a living, so he worked as a workers' accident insurance office during the day, and at night time, a bit like Superman, he became this great writer. But that was a constant struggle. And the one thing I really want to emphasize, and I'm going to pursue this in the next video with looking at the artwork of Gustav Caillebotte and the way in which cities have changed. The metamorphosis can also be interpreted not just in terms of the individual personality of a person or the psychology, but the world itself was going through a metamorphosis at the time that Kafka was writing. The huge changes in technology that we are also, it's ever since, the Industrial Revolution, this thing's been going on. But at certain periods of time, there seems to be an uptick in the pace of change. And Kirchner and Kafka were both portraying the radical fragmentation of what it felt to be an individual as it was becoming under threat by radically urbanizing environments. And maybe in our own day, we've got similar things going on with the rise of AI, the fragmentation of what a human personality is and considered to be. There's all types of these issues coming out. And then this is Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. So for, a contemporary, basically, of Kafka. I think Kafka was born in 1883, I think. And I think Kafka died in 1924. Apologies, I've got those dates wrong. They're off the top of my head, but I think they're accurate. So you can see that their lives overlapped. And he was the leader of a group called apologies, I don't know much German at all, but I think it's Die Brücke, or the Bridge group they were called. And he was hugely influential amongst German Expressionists. He fought in the army but was discharged, basically had a nervous breakdown, and he spent a long time travelling in... He went to sanatoriums in Switzerland. He suffered from addiction and, as I already said, had a nervous breakdown, so he wasn't in psychologically the greatest of health. And I seem to remember reading he died in 1938. I think he was fearful that the Germans were going to invade Switzerland. I think he was in Switzerland at the time, and I think that it's slightly ambiguous as to whether he took his own life or not. But it's a distinct possibility, and shortly before he died, when the Nazis came into power, he was labelled one of the degenerate artists. They had a degenerate art campaign where art they didn't like was labelled in this way, and he had to leave Germany to escape the consequences of that. But I just think his work fit quite nicely this concept of fragmentation and alienation and anxiety, and the search to define your own authentic self, I think fits quite well with Kafka's work. So this is just one example. And I think every illustration I'm going to use is from his work, except shortly I'll be showing you a painting by Edward Hopper, which I just really wanted to include, but I'm pretty sure that every other image I show you is by Kirchner. And just to give you a sense of the mentality or the ethos in the Chronic de Brücke, the Brücke, I don't know, it's Brücke, I'll just say Brücke from now on. The Brücke Chronicle, the bridge, the movement, their little manifesto, there's a quote, it's saying it focused on the freedom of life and of movement against the long established older forces. So that was its own search for authenticity. And this is I've used as the thumbnail. De Amselfleur. That's the name of the peak, apparently, like the Alpine peak in the background, and it's from 1922. And I just think it's a beautiful depiction of the individual surrounded by. We'll see some examples mostly in the next video about the depiction of the threatening external nature of the city. But this is all, he's also done this portrayal of the strength of external forces in nature itself. And that's just a closer shot. So to move on to Kafka, this is to give you some context for the beginning of the metamorphosis when he wakes up as this type of bug. This was an unfinished short story, wedding preparations in the country. So he says, as I lie in bed, this is the character, I assume the form of a large beetle, a stag beetle, I think. The form of a large beetle, yes. I would then act as though it was a matter of hibernation. I would press my little legs to my bulbous body, and I would whisper a small number of words, instructions to my sad body, which stands close by me and is bent over. Soon I am done, it bows down, it goes quickly, and it will manage everything in the best way possible while I rest. So it's this, he already had this in his mind, this idea of staying in bed while he sent out this alter ego to go and do all the tasks for him. So the metamorphosis isn't like that. There's not this bodily separation. The way it's described in the Metamorphosis, he becomes the very thing. And also, he's trapped in the apartment. He's not able to go out. So it's a twist on this previous idea. But this is just to show you the context, how Kafka's ideas 9 years before he wrote it in 1915. Remember, it was written Metamorphosis in 1915, published 1916. So this was 9 years earlier. And this is the image I mentioned of Hopper. This idea of someone in bed, admittedly he's either getting in or getting out. But I just like the atmospheric, big feet, hasn't he? But the atmospheric nature of this one. He doesn't mess around with his titles, Hopper, either. I like that. So to dive in to the Metamorphosis again. One morning when Gregor Samsa woke from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. He lay on his armour-like back, and if he lifted his head a little, he could see his brown belly, slightly domed, I know the feeling, and divided by arches into stiff sections. The bedding was hardly able to cover it, and seemed ready to slide off at any moment. His many legs, pitifully thin compared with the rest of him, waved about helplessly as he looked. So I'd argue, and I have argued before, that there's a sense of humour in Kafka. So it's obviously, we'll talk in a second about the concept of unheimlich, or the uncanny. It's a weird, unsettling image of being turned into this beetle-like creature. But there's always humour there. So his many legs, pitifully thin compared with the size of the rest of him, waved about helplessly as he looked. And then in the actual German, I think the phrase is, there's ungeheuer and ungeziefer is monstrous, horrible, or monstrous vermin. And unruhigen is uneasy. So it's, he woke from troubled dreams or uneasy dreams. So in the first sentence, you've got ungeheuer and ungeziefer and unruhigen. That sounds more Swedish, doesn't it? I apologise to any German speakers. Unruhigen, unruhigen. Tomato, tomato. But there's a lot of negative prefixes, which gives a rhythm to the sentence that I don't think you quite get in English. And I saw one description by a scholar. They said they described Kafka's work as initio fugal, which it's supposed to replicate the concept of something like centrifugal. But in Kafka's case, they argued that the starting point in a Kafka story determines everything. So he adopts an image or a premise and he runs with it and takes it as far as it possibly goes. What's happened to me, he thought. It was no dream. His room, a proper room for a human being, only somewhat too small, lay quietly between the four well-known walls. Above the table on which an unpacked collection of sample cloth goods was spread out, Sam's was a travelling salesman, hung the picture, which he had cut out of an illustrated magazine a little while ago, and set in a pretty gilt frame. It was a picture of a woman with a fur hat and a fur boa. She sat erect there, lifting up in the direction of the viewer a solid fur muff into which her entire forearm disappeared. Just to specify, I'm not using the whole of the story. I'm trying to take out the key paragraphs. So today I'm doing part 1, I'll do a section on part 2, and then finish with part 3. So it's not the whole text, but it's a significant proportion of it. And also the images I'll be interspersing aren't supposed to be exact illustrations, or there's no exact parallel with the text. I'm just hoping there's some useful resonance. So in the previous quote as well, this idea of uneasy dreams, and here he says, what's happened to me, thought it was no dream. I'd actually question that. I think there's quite a strong argument to suggest, a bit like I've said in the live stream, a bit like the Hitchcock film Vertigo, which I strongly believe the whole film is a dream. It's possible that he wakes up in his own dream, but he's actually not awake, he's still dreaming. So is he dreaming within a dream? And I'll explore as we go along this concept of his room, a proper room for a human being, only somewhat too small. I think the way he uses the bedroom is representative of the concept of the ego. I think it's very clever. He literalizes the notion of the ego within the narrowness, the claustrophobic nature of these four walls. And it works in the family situation that he's depicting, because I think it's quite close to Kafka's own bedroom in his parents' apartment, the family apartment. It wasn't truly a bedroom. It was like a room that had doors on all sides. It was almost like a thoroughfare rather than a room. So when in a second you'll hear these voices coming from various side doors, I think that was true to Kafka's own life. But that adds to the concept of the room as the ego, because you also have then the voices from the outside, which are like the superego. And the concept of the dreaming, it's, obviously a long tradition of literature based upon dreaming. But just in case you weren't aware of them, when I was reading this, it reminded me of Cervantes, who eventually, I would love to do Don Quixote, I have mentioned it. But he did, obviously much lesser known than Don Quixote. Cervantes did a collection called Novelas Ejemplares, exemplary stories in English. And that was, I'm trying to think, 1613. There's one called the Colloquy of the Dogs, or the Dialogue of the Dogs, I think I've seen it translated as. And that's hilarious. I think it's a guy, he's got syphilis and he's in a hospital bed, and he's not fully compos mentis, but he imagines two dogs outside by the window are having this conversation. And it's brilliantly funny and interesting. And then there's something about Spanish literature in the early 1600s, both plays and Cervantes arguably developing the first modern novel. But there was a guy called Pedro Calderón de la Barca, literally a Calderon of the boat. And he wrote a play called La Vida es Sueño, Life is a Dream. So there's some really, this is how long, 400 years before Kafka, this has been a theme, this notion of dreaming and how it relates to our own psyche. And then just to give you a bit of context, it was a picture of a woman with a fur hat and a fur boa. Most scholars agree that this has some reference to Venus in Furs, was a novel by Saka Masok, who gives us the phrase sadomasochism, is where the phrase comes from. And in that novel, Venus in Furs, Gregor is one of the characters. He's the alter ego. I think it's Severin is the guy, and his gimp-like, submissive alter ego is called Gregor. So I do think there's an in-joke there that Kafka's using. But these are some of the Kirchner's pictures of what he called cocottes, I think it is. But basically they're streetwalkers. And I think that addresses the concept of alienation and fragmentation, the way in which the men the predatory men in the background, and the woman herself, the way it's depicted at quite an angular, fragmentary level. And there's just a line, Red Cocotte, there's a line in the Venus and Furs novel. What's her name? Wanda, I think it is talking to Severin. And he has this dream. His girlfriend's called Wanda, but he dreams of her as the goddess Venus in furs. And she whispers to him in this dream, "Stay in your northern mist and Christian incense and leave our pagan world to rest under the lava and rubble." So it's interesting that it's represented in the book that basically European Western culture is repressed. And this is one of the themes in Kirchner's work, this repressed sexuality. I'll just show you, there's a few street scenes that he does. I've got the full quote. I'd forgotten. I've got the full quote that I just tried to remember. But this is the full Wander to Severin. "You modern men, you children of reason, cannot begin to appreciate love as pure bliss and divine serenity. Indeed, this kind of love is disastrous for men like you, for as soon as you try to be natural, you become vulgar. To you, nature is an enemy. Stay in your northern mists and Christian incense, and leave our pagan world to rest under the lava and the rubble. Do not dig us up. Pompeii was not built for you, nor were our villas, our bath and our temples. You do not need the gods. They would freeze to death in your climate." It's a beautiful way of putting it. But as you can see, this was a constant theme, the sexuality of the time. Gregor then turned to look out the window at the dull weather. Drops of rain could be heard hitting the pane, which made him feel quite sad. "How about if I sleep a little bit longer and forget all this nonsense," he thought. But that was something he was unable to do, because he was used to sleeping on his right, and in his present state couldn't get into that position. "Oh God," he thought, "what a strenuous career it is that I've chosen, travelling day in and day out." Now, in terms of authenticity, I think the fact he was a travelling salesman, so he's subject to train timetables, which is discussed at the beginning of the story. It must be a terrible job to have to go, have doors shut in your face, talk about being a tiny little cog in a wheel. And at least there have been lots of scholars talking about Kafka was interested in Eastern philosophy, so the Upanishads and Buddhist and Hindu writings. And it's interesting that samsara is an Eastern phrase for the cycle of life, the cycle of death and rebirth. So at least some scholars have suggested samsa might be some type of pun on samsara. And Schopenhauer, who I've looked at briefly, but I'll be looking at in future in much more detail, he had this lovely phrase. He was such a curmudgeon, but he talks about the best thing you can do in life is basically try and avoid pain. And he had this phrase: "The will is the string, knowledge the sounding board, and pain the tone," which gives you a sense of his general tone when he was writing. But samsara has these connotations of wander, journey, bondage, all these ideas. So it fits quite neatly with the idea as a travelling salesman. There's even, I'm not convinced by this, but what do I know because I don't know much Czech, but the concept that his surname Samsa, it's been suggested it could be a contraction of the Czech phrase I am alone, Sam, and JSEM, so Sam Jasem or Yisem, Sam Yisem, Samsa, Samsa. This is one of the suggestions, and like I said, that means I am alone. And then finally, in terms of Eastern philosophy, the idea of reincarnation, the fact he wakes up as a beetle. Metempsychosis is a concept of, the transfiguration of souls or reincarnation, and the idea that you don't know what your crime is that led you to being reborn in another body, but it's written indelibly on your soul is the idea. And in his short story In the Penal Colony, that is the end of the short story. The idea is that the punishment is inscribed by this huge big machine on the victim's skin. But it's complicated because it goes to whole notions of original sin and all sorts. But this idea that you can see how an Eastern philosophy of reincarnation and not knowing what your crime was would appeal to Kafka, who was quite sensitive and absolutely riven with guilt all the time. But I'd suggest this notion of individual fragmentation, the way in which the individual becomes isolated within an urban context. You can see in this work by Kirchner how there's an alienating, fragmented tone to the way in which the people, the angles of the traffic, it's not exactly welcoming. And I quoted the Rilke Panther poem at the beginning, but in 1910, the notebooks of Malte Lorenz Brieger, the narrator of that says, they can't sleep because electric trolleys race clanging through my room. Automobiles rush over me. So the point I'm trying to make is that inside, Gregor, the character in the Metamorphosis, is having this metamorphosis, this transformation. But this was also happening in the city outside at that time in Europe. Doing business like this takes much more effort than doing your own business at home. And on top of that, there's the curse of travelling, worries about making train connections, bad and irregular food, contact with different people all the time, so you can never get to know anyone or become friendly with them. It can all go to hell. So this idea of fragmentation in a modern economic setting, it's quite explicit in the story. He felt a slight itch up on his belly, pushed himself slowly up on his back towards the headboard so that he could lift his head better, found where the itch was and saw that it was covered with lots of little white spots, which he didn't know what to make of. And when he tried to feel the place with one of his legs, he drew it quickly back, because as soon as he touched it, he was overcome by a cold shudder. So it's this literal embodiment of the fragmentation that's in the general atmosphere of his job manifests itself. But then if you read the story carefully, it's very arguable that he's actually changed physically, and I'd suggest much more strongly that the transformation he's gone through, the metamorphosis, is much more about how he perceives himself, and in the third part of the story, how his family view him. So Kafka's taken the metaphor of being turned into a bug and, my God, as you run with it. But I actually don't think, to some extent, that actually happened. Once I've got the money together to pay off my parents' debt to him, he's talking about his boss, another 5 or 6 years, I suppose, that's definitely what I'll do. That's when I'll make the big change. First of all, though, I've got to get up. My train leaves at 5. This is part of my argument. If he genuinely had turned into a bug, why would he think he's got any chance of getting the train? Or going for it still? Gregor, somebody called. It was his mother. It's 7:15. Didn't you want to go somewhere? That gentle voice. Gregor was shocked when he heard his own voice answering. It could hardly be recognised as the voice he had had before. As if from deep inside him there was painful and uncontrollable squeaking mixed in with it. The words could be made out at first, but then there was a sort of echo which made them unclear, leaving the hearer unsure whether he had heard properly or not. Gregor had wanted to give a full answer and explain everything, but in the circumstances contented himself with saying, "Yes, mother, yes, thank you, I'm getting up now." His father went back to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door, I beg of you." And there's two things I'd say there is, one, the acousmatic nature of the voices. So these voices that are just intrusively, it's not clear where they're coming from, although that's normally in cinematic terms. In this, you do know that they're behind the door. But there's also this issue of doors. So in the story Before the Law, from the trial, it's a self-contained section that I've spoken about before. There's this tantalizing hint of something radiant beyond the doorway at the very end of that story. And this you could see as a metaphor for his relations with his family. They're always behind doors, or he's going through the threshold of a door. And this number 3, I won't go into huge detail, but in the Kabbalah, mystical Jewish tradition, 3 is an incredibly important number. And ironically, I think it's present in, or manifested in, Hegel's notion of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, this generative idea of 3. But there's 3 areas in the story, the Metamorphosis. There's the outside that's referred to, the outside world. There's the living room, and then there's the bedroom. So again, these, I've mentioned earlier in different videos that Kafka was familiar with Freud. So these levels of the psyche, arguably, there's 3 attempts to leave the bedroom. There's 3 lodgers come to visit later on, and there's 3 other family members that Gregor's confronted by. And then in Kafka's own life, there's 3 unfinished novels. The first thing he wanted to do was get the lower part of his body out of the bed, but he had never seen this lower part and could not imagine what it looked like. It turned out to be too hard to move. It went so slowly, and finally, almost in a frenzy, when he carelessly shoved himself forwards with all the force he could gather, he chose the wrong direction, hit hard against the lower bedpost, and learned from the burning pain he felt that the lower part of his body might well, at present, be the most sensitive. And I've seen a description, the metamorphosis you could set against the castle. In the castle, it's this amorphous sense of the divine, or this godlike force from above that affects people below. So it's been described, Kafka's work, as an assault on the below from the divine. That would describe the castle, but also an assault on the divine from the below, which I think would describe Metamorphosis. The fact that you're turned into a bug is an assault in some senses against the divine order. The idea that human beings were chosen by God in the image of God, etc. When Gregor was already sticking halfway out of the bed, the new method was more of a game than an effort. All he had to do was rock back and forth. It occurred to him how simple everything would be if somebody came to help him. Two strong people, he had his father and the maid in mind, would have been more than enough. They would only have to push their arms under the dome of his back, peel him away from the bed, bend down with the load, and then be patient and careful as he swung over onto the floor, where, hopefully, the little legs would find a use. Should he really call for help, though, even apart from the fact that all the doors were locked? Despite all the difficulty he was in, he could not suppress a smile at this thought. I should have mentioned earlier when it talked about he'd lost his voice in Ovid's Metamorphosis, the losing of the voice, or I'm thinking of it in Gnosis as an echo. Echo can only repeat what other people have said, so she retains her voice, but it's of limited use. There's Actaeon is killed by his own hounds, he's turned into a stag. And he screams. There's this horrible phrase in Ovid where he screams, and it's not a human scream, but it's also not a pure animal scream. So it's this, he's profoundly cut off from the world because he's lost his voice. Now, in this story, it's embodied as he can only speak like a beetle, this weird, but metaphorically, arguably that just represents he can't speak to his own family anymore. He can't communicate with them. I'm sure anyone who's ever been in a family knows what that's like. But if he really was a beetle, despite all the difficulty he was in, he could not suppress a smile at this thought. When he very first wakes up, he doesn't seem, disproportionately upset when he realises what he's supposed to be. So, again, I just think it's ambiguous. I'm not going to claim he definitely isn't, but I think it's a deliberate ambiguity in the telling of the story. It's almost like a reversed resurrection. So I believe in Egyptian mythology, the scarab beetle is a symbol of resurrection. And in this story, Gregor's gone through reverse resurrection, been turned into something lower. Can the chief clerk come in to see you now, then? Asked his father impatiently, knocking at the door again. No, said Gregor. In the room on his right there followed a painful silence. In the room on his left his sister began to cry. This is my illness. I find this funny. And to defend myself, there's lots of evidence that Kafka was amused and found his own work funny. It's just the melodrama of a family setting. It's so ridiculous. And in the room on his left, his sister began to cry. So why did his sister not go and join the others? She'd probably only just got up and had not even begun to get dressed. And why was she crying? Was it because he had not got up and he had not let the chief clerk in because he was in danger of losing his job? And if that happened, his boss would once more pursue their parents with the same demands as before. This is the other thing. The fact that the chief clerks come, it's only a couple of hours since he's missed his train, if that. So I think this backs up the idea that this is all about Gregor's paranoia and he's dreaming about the things that bother him in his everyday life, money and his work, his job, etc., that bothers everybody. And you've got this combination. There's like the family pressure, the voices coming in from the side doors. You've got this, I would argue, this imaginary chief clerk. That's another layer that's external to the family, that's from the company. And it also reminded me, on a previous video, I looked at Kafka's short story, The Burrow. in a video I did on the OCD and David Foster Wallace's work. But the way in which he's almost in the burrow of his bedroom hearing these voices, these paranoid voices. He really did want to open the door, really did want to let them see him and to speak with the chief clerk. The others were being so insistent, and he was curious to learn what they would say when they caught sight of him. If they were shocked, then it would no longer be Gregor's responsibility and he could rest. If, however, they took everything calmly, he would still have no reason to be upset. And if he hurried, he really could be at the station for 8 o'clock. I'd argue this is the best evidence yet that it's more about psychological state than a physical state, because he's holding out the possibility that his family wouldn't be too shocked and he still might make the train. So in his own personal life, Kafka had problems about his own body. He wasn't exactly body positive about himself. There are suggestions that he could have had some type of either just being gay or some darker sexuality that he never acted on but was always there. So again, potentially this is all metaphorical for his family looking at him with disgust. It's wrapped up in the story that he's turned into a cockroach, but his status as a beetle-like creature is more about how his family view him emotionally, not literally. That's the whole cockroach thing is a very extended metaphor. And when you think of it, you're not having to be wed to a complete insistence that the cockroach metaphor works all the way through the story at every moment of the story. I think when you introduce a bit of ambiguity and a bit more nuance, it just adds layers to the story. Did you understand a word of all that? The chief clerk asked his parents. Surely he's not trying to make fools of us. Oh God, called his mother, who was already in tears. This is why I find it funny. He could be seriously ill and we're making him suffer. Greta, Greta, she then cried. Mother, his sister called from the other side. They communicated across Gregor's room. So he's been shouted at, he's lying in bed, so stressed out he believes he's a cockroach, while these family members are shouting across him. You'll have to go for the doctor straight away. Gregor is ill. Quick, get the doctor. Did you hear the way Gregor spoke just now? That was the voice of an animal, said the chief clerk with a calmness that was in contrast with his mother's screams. So you're not telling me that's not funny. Kafka had a sense of humour. Anna, his father called into the kitchen through the entrance hall, clapping his hands. Get a locksmith here now. And the two girls, their skirts swishing, immediately ran out through the hall, wrenching open the front doors of the flat as they went. How had his sister managed to get dressed so quickly? He's just obsessing about the most silly things. There was no sound of the door banging shut again. They must have left it open. People often do in homes where something awful has happened. And I do think there's some doorways are liminal spaces. They're border spaces. And I mentioned before The Law, the short story. But the way in which he concentrates Kafka on the entrance hall and then the outside external door to the flat being left open. I think some of these themes are picked up in the third section of the story when it's more about the social relations between the family and the outside world rather than the nature of his body in the first part of the story. And I particularly like this image because, again, it's got relevance to Kafka's own life. Apparently, he was the most annoying person at a dinner table because he had some weird notions about food and he had various digestive problems. And he convinced himself that he needed to chew his food inordinately. So when I eat, I hardly ever touch the sides of my mouth. I'm a gannet. But in his case, he'd just sit there endlessly chewing. And apparently, from his letters and stuff, people found it quite disgusting. You sat there, you finished your meal, and he's still chewing away. Gregor, in contrast, had become much calmer, so they couldn't understand his words anymore, although they seemed clear enough to him, clearer than before. Perhaps his ears had become used to the sound. They had realised, though, that there was something wrong with him and were ready to help. The first response to his situation had been confident and wise, and that made him feel better. He felt that he had been drawn back in among people, and from the doctor and the locksmith, he expected great and surprising achievements, although he did not really distinguish one from the other. Which is a bit of an odd non-distinction. And I just think this, again, makes me think that it's more about his inability to communicate with his own family than it is about him actually being a cockroach. And he just wants to be part of the, recognised and part of a normal functioning world. So in that sense, the doctor and the locksmith, as reminders of normality, are quite welcome to him. Whatever was said next would be crucial. So, in order to make his voice as clear as possible, he coughed a little. But taking care to do this, not too loudly, as even this might well sound different from the way that a human coughs, and he was no longer sure he could judge this for himself. Meanwhile, it had become very quiet in the next room. Perhaps his parents were sat at the table whispering with the chief clerk, or perhaps they were all pressed against the door and listening. So this is after the family have all run off once they've heard him. And again, it's this losing one's voice as a representation of not being heard or being understood. Gregor set himself to the task of turning the key in the lock with his mouth. He seemed, unfortunately, to have no proper teeth. How was he, then, to grasp the key? But the lack of teeth was, of course, made up for with a very strong jaw. Using the jaw, he was really able to start the key turning, ignoring the fact that he must have been causing some kind of damage, as a brown fluid came from his mouth, flowed over the key and dripped onto the floor. "Listen," said the chief clerk in the next room. "He's turning the key." Gregor was greatly encouraged by this, but they all should have been calling to him, his father and mother too. "Well done, Gregor," they should have cried. "Keep at it. Keep hold of the lock." And with the idea that they were all excitedly following his efforts, he bit on the key with all his strength, paying no attention to the pain he was causing himself. I think that's obviously it's a representation of the desire to be encouraged by his family. So again, it's more about the psychology of family relations than it is about the reality of him trying to open a door with a beetle mouth. And also there's, I don't know, an in literary joke. It's I'm trying to remember how to pronounce it. Paraklausothiron or paraklausothion. It's Greek phrase for lament beside a door. So if any of you ever did or looked at Shakespeare, Midsummer's Night Dream, there's Pyramus and Thisbe, the rude mechanicals, when they're doing the play within a play. They talk to each other through a wall. So paraklausothion, this notion of you're separated from your lover, it was a literary notion. It's a pre-existing literary form since ancient times that in some ways Kafka's provided an interesting spin on. He was still occupied with this difficult movement, unable to pay attention to anything else, when he heard the chief clerk exclaim aloud, "Oh," which sounded like the soughing of the wind. Now he also saw him. He was the nearest to the door, his hand pressed against his open mouth and slowly retreating, as if driven by a steady and invisible force. Gregor's mother, her hair still dishevelled from bed, despite the chief clerk's being there, looked at his father. At this, I think from memory, he's leaning against the double door as he's unlocked it, and he's manoeuvred himself around to try and exit the room. And what you're getting now is an extreme version of how your family or outsiders look at you, is what's being represented in the story. Then she unfolded her arms, took 2 steps towards Gregor and sank down onto the floor into her skirts that spread themselves out around her as her head disappeared down onto her breast. His father looked hostile and clenched his fists as if wanting to knock Gregor back into his room. Then he looked uncertainly around the living room, covered his eyes with his hands and wept so that his powerful chest shook. I find it humorous because of the melodramatic nature of it. Standing out clearly from the other side of the street was a part of the endless grey-black house situated opposite. It was a hospital, with its severe regular windows breaking up the facade. The rain was still coming down, but only in large individual drops, visibly and firmly thrown down one by one onto the ground. The breakfast dishes were standing piled around on the table, because for his father breakfast was the most important meal time in the day, which he prolonged for hours by reading various newspapers. Directly across on the opposite wall hung a photograph of Gregor from the time of his military service. It was a picture of him as a lieutenant, as he, smiling and worry-free, with his hand on his sword, demanded respect for his bearing and uniform. The door to the hall was ajar, and since the door to the apartment was also open, one saw out into the landing of the apartment and the start of the staircase going down. So various things in reverse order, the idea that, again, this thing about borders and liminal spaces, being able to see the outside, the start of the staircase going down, the entrance into the external world. So the door to the hall was ajar, and then the door to the apartment was also open, and then you can also see the staircase, these various layers. And then there's the representation, the photograph of Gregor in his uniform from his military service. That will be a time when, smiling and worry-free, and you're guessing, assuming that his family have this photograph of him, demanded respect for his bearing and uniform. That's when his family would have looked upon him with respect. And in direct opposite to that, you had Ernst Kirchner's experience of having to leave the army through a nervous breakdown, which he portrays or alludes to in this painting. And notice that's the exact same year that the Metamorphosis was written. But the chief clerk had turned away as soon as Gregor had started to speak, and, with protruding lips, only stared back at him over his trembling shoulders as he left. He did not keep still for a moment while Gregor was speaking, but moved steadily towards the door without taking his eyes off him. He moved very gradually, as if there had been some secret prohibition on leaving the room. It was only when he reached the entrance hall that he made a sudden movement, drew his foot from the living room, and rushed forward in a panic. In the hall, he stretched his right hand far out towards the stairway, as if out there was some supernatural force waiting to save him. Again, it's a great melodramatic description of someone being scared of the cockroach man. And I think this is the aspect of unheimlich, the uncanny, that I'll be exploring in the live stream on the E.T.A. Hoffman story, The Sandman, which Freud used to illustrate the concept of the uncanny. But in German, uncanny is unheimlich, which means unhomelike. And what you've got is this scene of domesticity, just an average apartment, where you've got this description of someone being so shocked. So this is the prosaic writing drew his foot from the living room. It's a very domestic setting, but there's the horror of what he's seeing. For the first time that day, he began to feel all right with his body. The little legs had the solid ground under them. To his pleasure, they did exactly as he told them. They were even making the effort to carry him where he wanted to go, and he was soon believing that all his sorrows would soon be finally at an end. He held back the urge to move, but swayed from side to side as he crouched there on the floor. His mother was not far away in front of him and seemed, at first, quite engrossed in herself, but then she suddenly jumped up with her arms outstretched and her fingers spread, shouting, "Help, for pity's sake, help!" The way she held her head suggested she wanted to see Gregor better, but the unthinking way she was hurrying backwards showed that she did not. She had forgotten that the table was behind her with all the breakfast things on it. When she reached the table, she sat quickly down on it, without knowing what she was doing, without even seeming to notice that the coffee pot had been knocked over, and a gush of coffee was pouring down onto the carpet. I don't know. Also, the gush of the coffee. It's remember the brown liquid coming out of his own body when he hurt himself trying to unlock the door. And there's a potential parallel there. I don't know why. I absolutely love this painting. Like the demon child in the background with the overly long arms. And the way the women are looking. Nothing would stop Gregor's father as he drove him back, making hissing noises at him like a wild man. Gregor had never had any practice in moving backwards and was only able to go very slowly. If Gregor had only been allowed to turn around, he would have been back in his room straight away, but he was afraid that if he took the time to do that, his father would become impatient, and there was the threat of a lethal blow to his back or head from the stick in his father's hand any moment. Eventually, though, Gregor realised that he had no choice, as he saw to his disgust that he was quite incapable of going backwards in a straight line. So he began as quickly as possible, and with frequent anxious glances at his father, to turn himself round. It went very slowly, but perhaps his father was able to see his good intentions, as he did nothing to hinder him. In fact, now and then he used the tip of his stick to give directions from a distance as to which way to turn. If only his father would stop that unbearable hissing. And that's interesting that previously Gregor was unable to speak coherently. And now his father is talking to him, almost as if his father's thinking, how do you talk to a cockroach? So he's hissing at him. It was making Gregor quite confused. When he had nearly finished turning round, still listening to that hissing, he made a mistake and turned himself back a little the way he had just come. He was pleased when he finally had his head in front of the doorway, but then saw that it was too narrow and his body was too broad to get through it without further difficulty. In his present mood, it obviously did not occur to his father to open the other of the double doors so that Gregor would have enough space to get through. He was merely fixed on the idea that Gregor should be got back into his room as quickly as possible. Nor would he ever have Nor would he ever have allowed Gregor the time to get himself upright as preparation for getting through the doorway. What he did, making more noise than ever, was to drive Gregor forwards all the harder, as if there had been nothing in the way. It sounded to Gregor as if there was now more than one father behind him. It was not a pleasant experience, and Gregor pushed himself into the doorway without regard for what might happen. So this is, an encapsulation of an overbearing parental influence, the father. It sounded to Gregor as if there was now more than one father behind him. It was not a pleasant experience. On one side of his body, one side of his body lifted itself. He lay at an angle in the doorway. One flank scraped on the white door and was painfully injured, leaving vile brown flecks on it. Soon he was stuck fast and would not have been able to move at all by himself. The little legs along one side hung quivering in the air, whilst those on the other side were pressed painfully against the ground. Then his father gave him a hefty shove from behind, which released him from where he was held and sent him flying and heavily bleeding deep into his room. The door was slammed shut with the stick. Then, finally, all was quiet. So at the very end of the first part, that's the first time. It's interesting. That's when silence descends. It's almost emblematic of the father's no longer trying to communicate with the son at this point. He's beyond the pale, so to speak. And again, sorry to go on about it, but the door was slammed shut. It's always with the doors. Right, well, I hope you enjoyed that one. Next time, if you've not seen Gustav Caillebott's art, you're in for a treat. And I will do section 2 as well. So all the very best till the next time. I'll leave off with one final Kirchner image.